Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you the new science fiction stories for you, and new adventure, new world.
They called her the ghost of the Crimson Corridor, not because she was stealthy, because she was the only human ever admitted to the Galactic War Academy, and for 3 years, no one heard her speak, until the simulation went live. Until the cameras caught what happens when a species that evolved chasing prey across savannas for 2 million years finally gets let off the leash. The first time Senior Tactical Officer Vrelk saw the human, he almost submitted a formal error report. He was reviewing the incoming cadet manifest for Cycle 47, his third set of compound eyes scanning the data streams with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this for 60 standard cycles. The usual species were present. The razor-clawed Ktharn from the mining colonies. The crystalline Viridi with their perfect mathematical minds. The hulking boars, bred for heavy gravity worlds and close-quarters combat. All the usual predators and thinkers and warriors that the Galactic War Academy collected like trophies. Then his primary eyes caught the anomaly. Species, human. World, Terra, Soltarse. Classification, non-aligned, pre-FTL contact avoided, status, observer applicant. Vrelk's mandibles clicked in confusion. He pulled up the attached file, expecting to find an error, a glitch, a prank from one of his junior officers. Instead, he found a thick dossier marked with the personal seal of the Academy's headmistress herself, Admiral Thraxis of the 5th Council Fleet. Cadet Miranda Chun is to be admitted as a full tactical student. No special accommodations. No restrictions. She will be evaluated on the same standards as any other cadet. Signed, Thraxis. Vrelk read the file 3 times. Then, he did something he hadn't done in 40 cycles. He laughed. A human. A human. The species that had barely crawled out of its gravity, 3 generations ago. The species that still killed each other over imaginary lines drawn in dirt. The species that, by every civilized metric, was a walking calamity of emotional instability and primitive biology. They had no natural weapons. No claws, no venom, no armor. Their skin was soft enough to puncture with a dull stylus. Their eyes could only see a pathetic sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Their hearing stopped at frequencies that most Academy species considered subsonic. Their muscles, for all their dense protein structure, could only output brief, unsustainable bursts of power before drowning in their own metabolic waste. And now one of them was going to sit in his classroom. The Cycle 47 orientation hall was designed to intimidate. That was the point. The Academy didn't want soft species. It didn't want the weak or the indecisive. It wanted the apex predators of 1,000 worlds, and the hall reflected that. The ceiling soared 300 meters high, carved from black obsidian mined from a dying star's core. The lighting was harsh, deliberately harsh, casting sharp shadows that made every cadet look like a silhouette of violence. And the air smelled of ozone and old blood pumped in from the training pits below. 412 cadets stood in formation. 412 killers from 47 species. And in the exact center of the third row, standing in perfect stillness, was the human. Vrelk watched her from the instructor's platform. She was small. That was his first thought. Compared to the hulking boars beside her, who stood 3 meters tall and massed as much as a light ground vehicle, she looked like a child. Her limbs were thin. Her shoulders were narrow. Her face, that strange, flat, forward-facing predator's face, was utterly expressionless. But her eyes were moving. That was the second thing Vrelk noticed. While the other cadets stood at rigid attention, their various sensory organs locked forward in disciplined stillness, the human's eyes were working. They darted left, right, up, down. They cataloged exits. They measured distances. They tracked the positions of every cadet within her line of sight, and, Vrelk suspected, many outside it. She was hunting with her eyes. Not aggressively, not obviously, but she was doing it unconsciously, the way a herbivore might chew cud. It was so deeply baked into her biology that she probably didn't even know she was doing it. The boars next to her noticed Vrelk's gaze and rumbled in amusement. The little thing is terrified. Look at her twitching. The human didn't react. Either she hadn't heard, possible given the boars' low-frequency voice, or she simply didn't care. Orientation proceeded. The headmistress gave her traditional speech about duty and honor and the weight of command. The cadets received their quarters assignments and their first cycle schedules. And then, mercifully, it was over. Vrelk retreated to his office and began the mountain of paperwork that accompanied every new cycle. He didn't think about the human again until the following morning, when his first class of the cycle filed into his tactical analysis lecture hall. She sat in the back, all the way in the back, in the corner seat that had a clear view of both doors and everyone in the room. It was the seat that the most paranoid cadets always chose, the ones who had survived things they shouldn't have. But this human hadn't survived anything. She was barely old enough to have left her homeworld, by the file's reckoning. 23 standard cycles. Practically an infant. Vrelk launched into his lecture. The subject was asymmetrical void warfare, focusing on the Third Ktharn insurrection and the tactical errors that had cost the Council fleet 17 capital ships. He presented data. He showed battle recordings. He asked questions. The Ktharn in the front row answered first, as they always did. They were brilliant tacticians, the Ktharn, with instincts honed by 100 generations of pack hunting. Their answers were sharp and aggressive and usually correct. The Viridi answered second, their crystalline forms chiming with perfectly calculated probability matrices. The Boars answered third, when they answered at all, favoring brute force solutions that were ugly but effective. And the human sat in the back, silent. She took notes. Vrelk saw that much. Her hand moved across her datapad with quick, efficient strokes, filling screen after screen with text and diagrams. But she never spoke, never raised her hand, never made eye contact when Vrelk looked her way. The first week passed, then the second, then the first month. Cadet Miranda Chun attended every class, sat in the back of every lecture hall, took notes on every subject, aced every written examination with scores that Vrelk initially refused to believe were possible. Perfect recall, perfect analysis, perfect tactical breakdowns. But she never spoke. Not in class. Not in the mess hall. Not in the simulation bays, where the other cadets ran practice drills and screamed encouragement or insults at each other across the networked void. She would enter the sim bay, run her required drills with flawless technical execution, and leave. No small talk. No camaraderie. No threats or boasts or the casual violence that pass for social bonding among predator species. The other cadets noticed. Of course they noticed. The ghost, they called her. Then, when that proved too poetic the mute, the Boars in particular took a liking to tormenting her. A juvenile species needed to learn its place, after all. They would block her path in the corridors. They would knock her datapad from her hands. They would speak over her in the few group exercises that required verbal collaboration, ignoring her written contributions even when they were clearly superior. The human never reacted. She would retrieve her datapad. She would find another path. She would wait for the Boars to finish speaking and then submit her analysis in writing directly to Vrelk's terminal, where he had no choice but to read it and incorporate it and give her credit she never claimed aloud. It was unsettling. Vrelk had taught at the academy for 60 cycles. He had seen every type of cadet. He had seen the cruel and the kind, the brilliant and the stupid, the broken and the whole. But he had never seen anyone like this human. She was a riddle, a quiet, patient, utterly unreadable riddle. He went to the headmistress. Admiral, the human. Chun. She doesn't speak. In 2 months of training, she has not spoken a single word in any class or communal setting. I've reviewed the medical scans. Her vocal apparatus is functional. She has no diagnosed communication impairments. So why is she here? What are you not telling me? Phraxis was old. Very old. Her species, the ancient and long-lived Drakari, did not show age the way softer species did. Instead, their scales grew darker, their eyes more distant, their silences longer. Firaxis had been old when Vrelk was a cadet. Now she was ancient. She looked at Vrelk with those dark, patient eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then, do you know why we admitted her, Vrelk? Political pressure? A gesture of inclusion toward the newly contacted species? Firaxis almost smiled. No, we admitted her because she passed the entrance examination. Vrelk's mandibles went slack. That's impossible. The entrance examination requires, I am aware of what it requires. She passed it anyway. A perfect score. The first perfect score in 200 cycles. Admiral, with respect, that's impossible? Yes, I thought so too. And then I watched the recording. She turned her terminal to face him. On the screen, the simulation began. The entrance examination. The infamous gauntlet. A scenario so brutal, so unforgiving that only 40% of applicants survived to the end and only 10% passed. The human was in the simulation. She looked younger than she did now, smaller, more uncertain. She was placed on a disabled civilian transport with a dozen other applicants, all from different species, all with different skills. The scenario: survive for 6 hours while a derelict council warship, its automated defenses still active, drifted toward collision with the transport's reactor. Vrelk had watched hundreds of applicants run the gauntlet. He knew every strategy, every common approach. The aggressive ones tried to storm the warship and disable its systems directly. The clever ones tried to hack its command codes. The patient ones tried to evacuate the transport before the collision. The human did none of these things. Instead, she spent the first hour walking the transport's corridors. Not running. Walking. Slowly. Methodically. She touched walls. She listened to pipes. She counted the emergency bulkheads and the life support vents and the access panels. She did not speak to the other applicants, though several spoke to her. She simply walked and listened and touched. Then, she went to the transport's engineering section and began pulling panels off the walls. The other applicants watched her, confused. Some laughed. Some ignored her. One of the boars, larger even than the one in Vrelk's class, grabbed her by the collar and lifted her off the ground. What are you doing, little thing? There's no time for scavenging. She didn't struggle. She didn't speak. She simply reached up very calmly and placed her palm against the boar's wrist. A specific spot. A spot that, Vrelk now noticed, corresponded exactly to a major nerve cluster in Boar's anatomy. The boars dropped her. Not because she hurt him. She couldn't have, not with that light touch. But because something in her eyes made him want to drop her. Something cold and patient and utterly without fear. She went back to pulling panels. An hour later, she had rerouted the transport's power distribution. Not to the engines. They were dead. Not to the life support. It was already stable. She rerouted power to the emergency maneuvering thrusters. Small ones. Almost insignificant ones. The kind used for minor course corrections, not combat maneuvers. Then she waited. The warship drifted closer. The collision alarm sounded. The other applicants began to panic, some running for the escape pods, which the clever ones had already discovered were non-functional, some making desperate last-minute assaults on the warship's airlocks. The human waited until the warship was exactly 1.7 kilometers away. Then, she fired the maneuvering thrusters. Not to move the transport. There wasn't enough power for that. Instead, she fired them in a specific sequence, a sequence that took Vrelk several seconds to recognize and then several more seconds to believe. She was creating a resonance, a harmonic frequency in the transport's hull that matched the warship's active sensor pulse. The warship's automated defenses, designed to target active threats, suddenly couldn't decide what the transport was. Was it a ship? Was it an echo? Was it a sensor ghost? The targeting systems cycled through a dozen modes, searching for a solution that didn't exist. And, in the confusion, the human walked through the warship's open airlock. She had disabled its threat response simply by making herself invisible. Not invisible to eyes, invisible to the logic that governed the ship's mind. The rest of the recording was anticlimactic. She walked to the warship's bridge, disabled its command core with a simple power cycle she'd learned from watching the transport's maintenance panels, and ended the simulation. Perfect score. Vrelk stared at the frozen image on the screen. The human stood on the warship's bridge, her face still expressionless, her eyes still moving, cataloging, measuring, hunting. She doesn't speak, Thraxis said quietly, because she's listening. She's always listening. And when she finally speaks, Vrelk, I suspect everyone will wish she hadn't. The second year was worse. Not for the human. As far as Vrelk could tell, nothing was ever worse for the human. She continued her silent routine. Classes, written exams, simulation drills. Back to her quarters. Repeat. Her scores remained flawless. Her social life remained non-existent. No, the second year was worse for everyone else. The boars who had tormented her in the corridors found their carefully maintained hierarchies collapsing. Not because the human fought back. She never fought back, but because the other cadets had started noticing things. Small things. Things that shouldn't have been possible. Like the time a Ktharn cadet challenged the lead boars to a combat drill and lost badly, only to discover that someone had tampered with his weapon calibration beforehand. The boars swore innocence. The investigation turned up nothing. But the human had been in the armory the night before, alone, checking her own equipment. Or the time a Verity cadet's probability matrices started producing bizarrely accurate predictions about other cadets' behavior, who would cheat on exams, who would start fights, who would crack under pressure. The Verity insisted the data was coming from somewhere else, bleeding into her crystalline lattice like static from a broken transmission. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't control it. She could only watch as the predictions came true, one after another, with terrifying precision. The human had been sitting next to the Verity in the mess hall when it started. Not speaking, just sitting, eating her tasteless nutritional paste with the same methodical efficiency she applied to everything. The whispers started. She's not mute. She's hiding something. She's not a cadet. She's a spy. She's not human. She's something else wearing human skin. Vrelk heard the whispers. He didn't discourage them, because they weren't entirely wrong. Something was off about Cadetchen. Something that went beyond her silence. He started watching her more closely. Not in class. Her academic performance was exemplary and, by now, expected. He watched her in the simulation base. He watched her in the training yards. He watched her during the mandatory physical conditioning sessions, where the human's pathetic biology was supposed to put her at the bottom of every ranking. It didn't. Oh, she wasn't strong. The boars could lift 10 times her mass. She wasn't fast. The Ktharn could sprint 3 times her velocity. She wasn't durable. The Verity's crystalline bodies could withstand impacts that would shatter every bone in her fragile frame. But she never stopped. That was the thing Vrelk noticed cycle after cycle as the physical training progressed. The other cadets would exhaust themselves. Their various metabolisms would hit their limits, flood their systems with fatigue toxins, force them to rest and recover. The human would also hit her limits. Her face would flush red. Her breathing would turn ragged. Sweat would pour from her skin in ways that Vrelk initially found disgusting and later found fascinating. But she wouldn't stop. She would slow down. Her movements would become less precise. Her reaction times would degrade. But she would keep moving, keep pushing, keep existing in a state that every other species in the Academy would have classified as incapacitated. The boars called it stubbornness. Stupid, pointless, self-destructive stubbornness. The Ktharn called it desperation. The pathetic flailing of a prey species that had forgotten it was prey. The Verity called it interesting. The Verity were the only ones who watched the human with something other than contempt or fear. They saw the data. They saw the patterns. And what they saw made their crystalline lattices hum with an emotion they couldn't quite name. She is not stubborn, one of them said to Vrelk after a particularly grueling endurance drill. She is not desperate. She is something else. Something we don't have a word for. What do you mean? The Veridi's crystals pulsed in a way that Vrelk had learned to interpret as uncertainty. Her body is drowning. From the inside, when she pushes past her limits, her muscles begin to break down. Her cells start consuming themselves for energy. Her core temperature rises to levels that should cause her brain to cook in its own fluids. And yet she continues. And yet she continues. Not because she doesn't feel the pain. The readings are clear. She feels everything. Every broken fiber. Every shredded cell. Every screaming nerve. But there's something else. Something in her mind that is louder than the pain. Something that tells her to keep moving even when her body is begging her to stop. What? Vrelk asked. What is louder than survival? The Verity didn't answer. But Vrelk saw its crystals pulse once more, a pattern he'd never seen before, and he could have sworn it looked like fear. The crisis came in the middle of the second year. Not a simulated crisis, a real one. The Academy's home system was attacked. Not by pirates or rebels or any of the usual threats that lurked in the contested border regions. By something new, something unknown, something that emerged from a rift in space-time that should not have existed and proceeded to eat the system's outer defense platforms like a swarm of metallic locusts. The attack was coordinated, brutal, utterly without mercy or negotiation. Vrelk watched from the Academy's command center as the first wave of enemy vessels swarmed through the asteroid belt, their strange, organic shapes moving with a fluid grace that no council ship could match. They weren't just attacking. They were harvesting, mining the asteroids for resources, stripping the defense platforms for technology, processing everything into more of themselves. The council's response was immediate and inadequate. 3 cruisers jumped into the system and were torn apart within minutes. Their weapons, designed to fight conventional ships, did almost nothing against the swarm's adaptive armor. Their shields, calibrated for energy weapons, collapsed against the swarm's kinetic munitions. "Evacuate the cadets," Thraxis ordered. Her voice was calm, but Vrelk had known her long enough to hear the razor edge beneath. "All of them. Get them to the transport ships. We're abandoning the Academy." The evacuation was chaos. 400 panicked cadets from 47 species, all of them trained killers, all of them utterly useless against an enemy they couldn't understand. The corridors filled with shouting and shoving and the occasional burst of violence as old rivalries erupted in the stress of the moment. And in the middle of it all, silent as always, Cadet Miranda Chen walked toward the armory. Vrelk saw her on the security monitors. He almost didn't notice her. She was so small, so quiet, so easy to overlook in the chaos. But something made him zoom in on her feed. Something about the way she moved. The same way she'd moved in the entrance examination. Slow, methodical, unhurried. She wasn't evacuating. She was hunting. He found her in the armory, suiting up. Not in the heavy combat armor that the Boers favored, the kind that turned them into walking tanks. In something lighter, something more flexible, something that looked, to Vrelk's horrified eyes, almost completely useless. "What are you doing?" he demanded. She didn't look up from her work. Her hands moved across the armor's seals, checking each one with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. Going out there. Her voice was strange. Not because of the accent, though there was one, a soft, musical lilt that Vrelk couldn't place. But because of the weight of it. The sound of someone who didn't speak often, who chose every word with the care of a bomb disposal technician. "You can't," Vrelk said. "The enemy, I've been watching them." She pulled on her helmet, and her voice came through the speaker tinny and distant. "For 3 days. Since they entered the system, I've been watching every feed, every sensor reading, every scrap of data the Academy could pull from the defense platforms before they fell." And she finally looked at him. Her eyes, visible through the helmet's visor, were the same cold, patient eyes he'd seen in the orientation hall. But there was something else there now. Something that looked almost like excitement. "They're not a swarm," she said. "They're a hive. One mind. One will. A queen, somewhere in the heart of the formation, processing all the data from all the drones, and making all the decisions. If we can find her, you can't. The formation is too dense, too well defended. No ship in the fleet could penetrate that far. She smiled. It was the first time Vrelk had ever seen her smile, and it was not a comforting expression. It was the smile of something that had been waiting for a very long time, and had finally found what it was waiting for. I'm not going in a ship. She walked past him and out of the armory. Vrelk stood frozen for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Then, he ran after her. The launch bay was chaos. Cadets were pushing and shoving their way onto the evacuation transports, their earlier discipline forgotten in the face of genuine danger. No one paid any attention to the small figure in light armor walking toward the emergency airlock. No one except Vrelk. Chun, stop. You don't have authorization. She stepped into the airlock and turned to face him. Behind her visor, her expression had changed again. The coldness was gone. The excitement was gone. What remained was something Vrelk had never seen in any cadet, in any species, in 60 cycles of teaching. Certainty. Tell the fleet to watch the feeds, she said. And tell them to be ready. When I find a queen, she's going to scream. And that's when you hit her. The airlock cycled. The outer door opened. And Miranda Chun launched herself into the void. The first thing the enemy hive mind noticed was a single, insignificant life sign. Small, mammalian, pathetically fragile. The kind of life sign that the drones usually ignored because it wasn't worth the energy to harvest. But this one was moving strangely. Moving toward the swarm, not away from it. Moving with a purpose that the hive mind did not understand. The drones swarmed to investigate. They found a creature in primitive armor, maneuvering through the debris field with small gas thrusters. No weapons that the drones could detect. No shields. No support. Nothing but flesh and bone and the stubborn refusal to die. The hive mind processed this information and reached a conclusion, not a threat. It turned its attention back to the academy, to the evacuation transports, to the rich harvest of technology and biomass waiting to be claimed. It did not notice that the life sign kept moving. It did not notice that the life sign was counting the drones as they passed, memorizing their patterns, learning their patrol routes and communication frequencies and the subtle variations in their formation that indicated the presence of something larger, something more important. It did not notice any of this because, in its entire existence, the hive mind had never encountered anything like the thing now crawling through its blind spots. Vrelk watched from the command center, his compound eyes fixed on the human's bio signs as they ghosted through the swarm. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. No one could. The other instructors had gathered around his terminal, their various mouths hanging open in various states of shock. "How is she doing that?" someone whispered. Vrelk didn't answer, but he thought he understood. The same way she had disabled the warship's automated defenses in the entrance examination. She was making herself invisible. Not to sensors, the drones could clearly see her, but to the mind that was processing those sensor readings. The hive mind was intelligent, brilliantly so in its way, but its intelligence was alien. It processed threats based on patterns it understood. Weapons, ships, military formations, things that had heard it before, or that looked like things that had heard it before. It had no pattern for a single, unarmed human crawling through its debris field, because no sane species would ever try that. No sane individual would volunteer for suicide. No sane military would allow it. But the human wasn't sane. Not by the hive mind standards. Not by any species standards, Vrelk was beginning to realize. The human was something else. Something that had evolved on a world where persistence was more important than power, where endurance was more valuable than strength, where the ability to keep moving long after every logical part of your brain told you to stop was the difference between eating and being eaten. She had been silent at the academy because she had nothing to say. Not to them. Not to the boars who tormented her, or the Ktharn who dismissed her, or the Viridi who studied her. She had been watching, waiting, learning, and now she was speaking. Contact. Her voice crackled over the emergency channel. I see the Queen. The command center went silent. On the feed from her helmet camera, they saw it. A ship, but not like the drones. Larger, brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that looked almost like a heartbeat. Surrounded by a ring of elite drones, the biggest and most heavily armored Vrelk had yet seen, guarding it with fanatical devotion. The hive mind. Chun, Vrelk said, his voice barely a whisper. There's no way through those guards. You don't have the firepower, I know. She stopped moving, drifted in the void. Her biosigns were strange. Elevated heart rate, elevated respiration, elevated everything. But also something else. Something that looked like calm. They're protecting her from the outside, she said. From ships, from weapons, from everything they understand. But they're not protecting her from the inside. Inside, the drones communicate. They share data. They pass information from the edges of the swarm to the center. That's how she sees everything. That's how she controls everything. And if I can get into that stream, you'd have to interface with one of the drones. Directly. Physically. And even if you could, the data stream would kill me. Probably. She sounded almost cheerful about it. But probably isn't definitely. And I've been studying their communication protocols for 3 days. I think I can overload the connection. Feed them garbage. Noise. The kind of sensory data that a distributed intelligence can't process quickly. What kind of sensory data? Pain. She launched herself toward the nearest drone. The next 3 minutes were the longest of Vrelk's life. He watched as the human latched onto the drone's hull, her mag boots clamping onto its organic surface. He watched as she jammed a crude interface cable into a port that shouldn't have been accessible. He watched as her biosign spiked and then screamed as the data stream hit her nervous system. He heard her voice over the channel. Not speaking, not screaming, laughing. "Hello, Queen," she said. "Let me show you something." And then the feed exploded. Not literally, but the data coming from her helmet camera became a storm of noise and color and sensation. Vrelk caught fragments. Images from a human's memory, her childhood, her training, her entire life compressed into a weapon aimed at the hive mind's core. He saw a human child falling from a tree and breaking her arm. He saw a human teenager running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. He saw a human adult pushing through a fever, through exhaustion, through the cold, dark place where death lived, because there was something on the other side worth reaching. He saw 2 million years of evolution distilled into a single moment. The moment when a persistence predator finally found its prey. And he saw the hive mind recoil. The Queen screamed, not in pain, in fear. In the sudden, overwhelming realization that the creature in her midst was not prey at all, but something she had never encountered. Something that did not tire, did not quit, did not stop. Something that would chase her across the galaxy if she ran, through the void if she hid, into the heart of a star if that was what it took. Something that was, in every way that mattered, more relentless than she was. Now the human shouted, "Hit her now!" The Council fleet, which had been waiting at the edge of the system, didn't need to be told twice. They poured through the rift in the swarm's formation, the gap that had opened when the Queen's attention fractured, and unleashed everything they had. The hive mind tried to regroup, tried to defend itself. But its drones were confused, disoriented, receiving contradictory commands from a queen who couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. And in the center of it all, still clinging to the drone, still flooding the data stream with the unbearable weight of human persistence, Miranda Chun laughed again. "You should have stayed away from our galaxy," she said. "We're not the strongest. We're not the smartest. We're not the fastest. But we are, without a single doubt, the most stubborn things you will ever meet. And stubborn things don't know when to quit." The fleet's second salvo hit the Queen's ship. The explosion was beautiful, a flower of light and heat and dying alien consciousness. The drones went dark one by one, their connection to the hive mind severed, their organic systems shutting down without command. And Miranda Chin's biosigns went dark too. She woke up 3 days later in the Academy's medical bay. Not because she was supposed to, The Verity medics had given her a 0.03% chance of regaining consciousness. The neurological damage from the data stream should have been catastrophic. The physical damage from exposure to vacuum, minor radiation, and the drone's failed attempt to shake her loose should have been fatal. But she woke up anyway, because she was human. And humans, Vrelk was learning, had a tendency to do things that should have been impossible. He was sitting beside her bed when her eyes opened. He had been sitting there for 3 days, missing classes and briefings and the congratulations of his superiors, because something about this silent, stubborn creature had burrowed into his mind and refused to leave. "Chun," he said. "Vrelk." Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. But it was there. She was there. "The fleet is calling you a hero. The council is calling you a miracle. The cadets are calling you something I can't translate into galactic standard, but I believe it roughly means the one who walks through walls." She tried to smile. "It looked painful. I just did my job." "No." Vrelk leaned closer, his mandibles clicking in something that felt, for the first time in 60 cycles, like respect. "You did what no other species in the galaxy would even think to try. You threw yourself into certain death because you believed you could survive it. And you were right." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, can I go back to class?" Vrelk stared at her. Then, for the first time in his long, long life, Senior Tactical Officer Vrelk laughed. "You passed, Chun. All of it. Every class, every drill, every examination. The headmistress signed your commission herself. You're not a cadet anymore." "Oh." She seemed almost disappointed. "What am I then?" Vrelk pulled a data chip from his pocket. At the top of the file, inscribed in the formal script of the Galactic Council, were the words that would change everything humanity's place in the galaxy. Commissioned to the rank of Tactical Commander. Effective immediately. Assignment: Director of Special Operations, Human Liaison Division. "You're the first," Vrelk said quietly. "The first human officer in the Galactic Council's history. And if I'm right, and I believe I am, you won't be the last. Because we've been watching you, Chun. All of us. And we finally understand what you are." "What's that?" He thought about the right word. Not terrifying. Not dangerous. Not unpredictable. Something deeper. Something that captured the essence of what he had witnessed in those 3 minutes. "Inevitability," he said. "Your inevitability. And the galaxy is going to have to learn to live with that." Outside the medical bay, visible through the viewport, the repaired academy floated in the void. Cadets from 47 species were returning to their classes, their drills, their rivalries. But something had changed. Something had shifted. Because somewhere in the back of every mind, in the quiet space where fears lived, a new understanding was taking root. The humans were coming. And when they spoke, the galaxy would listen. The broadcast went live 3 weeks later. Not from the Academy. From Terra itself. From the blue-green world that the Galactic Council had dismissed as primitive, as irrelevant, as not yet ready to join the community of sentient species. The human stood at a podium. Not Miranda Chun, an older human, a male with gray hair and tired eyes, and the same stubborn set to his jaw that Vrelk was beginning to recognize as universal. "My name is General Marcus Webb," he said, "and I'm here to accept the Galactic Council's offer of formal diplomatic relations." The council chambers fell silent. The alien ambassadors shifted in their seats, their various sensory organs trained on the small, insignificant creature who had just claimed a seat at the table. "But first," General Webb continued, "I want to tell you a story. A story about a young woman named Miranda Chun, who was sent to your academy to prove that humanity deserved a chance. She wasn't supposed to succeed. She wasn't supposed to survive. She certainly wasn't supposed to save your entire system from an enemy you couldn't defeat." He paused, looked around the chamber, met the eyes of every ambassador, every species, every skeptic in the room. But she did, because that's what humans do. We don't give up. We don't quit. We don't know how. We've been fighting for our lives on a death world for 2 million years, and in all that time, the only thing that's ever beaten us is us. Everything else, the predators, the plagues, the famines, the wars, the collapsing climates, the asteroids, the void itself, Everything else has failed. He smiled. It was the same smile Vrelk had seen on Miranda Chen's face, right before she launched herself into certain death. So here's the deal. You can respect us. You can fear us. You can love us or hate us or ignore us. But you will remember this. You will remember that when the galaxy needed someone to do the impossible, they sent for a quiet girl from a primitive world. And she delivered. The chamber stayed silent for a long, long time. Then, slowly, one by one, the ambassadors began to clap. The monitors on Terra's screens flickered to life across every channel, every frequency, every communication network humanity had ever built. The same image repeated endlessly. A young woman in light armor, standing in an airlock, her eyes cold and patient and absolutely certain. And beneath the image a name, a combat name, the name that had spread across every channel, every system, every world in the galaxy. The ghost of the Crimson Corridor. She had never spoken at the Academy. Not a single word, not a single boast, not a single challenge. But when she finally did speak, the galaxy learned a truth that it would never forget. The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. Because they're not listening to you. They're waiting for you to stop making noise, so they can hunt.